Okay, just before I start, my name is Gabriel from Clark & Miller. You probably know that already because we have met online with the Ask the Expert chat we had, the webinar we had. And so nice to see you again. There's no better phrase for that, is there? It's just nice to have you here virtually in the space around us. So today I want to talk very quickly about how to use images to improve learning in the classroom and how to exploit images to help your students learn quicker, learn more effectively, to retain information. So we're going to get started straight away. Back in 2012, my partner and I moved to Istra in Russia. It was a quiet little town, one of those Moscow satellites where people working in the city move for a cheap house to bring up their family. The town pretty much consisted of pensioners, nuclear families, and a lot of bored teenagers. There wasn't much to do there at all, and I spent a lot of time just walking around, taking photos of anything. My partner and I were the only first language English speakers in the whole town, and almost nobody spoke English as a second language. Not that pensioners, nuclear families, and bored teenagers particularly wanted to speak to us, they had better things to do. But this didn't stop us from making a serious attempt at learning some Russian, at least survival Russian. So, weeks before the move, we got a copy of Michel Thomas's course on Russian. Do you know this guy? Do you know anything about this guy? Michel Thomas is worthy of a whole talk in and of itself. One longer than half an hour, I can tell you. He may look like a mafia don, but he was so much more. Apart from being a war hero, a polyglot, and a ridiculously charming guy, Thomas was also an excellent educator. He developed a teaching approach that consisted of him sitting in front of two people, one man and one woman, always the same formula, and describing the language they wanted to learn in their own first language. What made him so good at this was that he had a skill for observing the patterns and similarities between the L1 and the L2. He recorded these lessons and did rather well selling the tapes and CDs as self-study courses. For the languages that he didn't speak, he recruited teachers who trained in his method and who then went on to create their own course using his approach. And that's what happened for the Michel Thomas Russian course. Natasha, our Russian teacher, we'd always hear but never see, was the one who gave us our basic Russian skills. And there was something Thomas did a bit that Natasha really went to town with. She used what I call memory hooks. I'll give you an example. Let's look at the word panimats. Russian for anyone? Yes, it means understand. Okay, so she'd say something like, I want you to imagine a pony, and the pony is sitting on a mat. You have that now? Okay, and what's the pony saying? The pony is saying, I don't understand. Pony, mat, panimats. Right, weird, but it worked. This was the first and only time I needed the meaning of that particular word explained to me. And it worked for all sorts of other words. You got zavtrak, breakfast, sitting in a truck having breakfast with a Tsar, spisic, to rush. Humans are the only species to rush. Budu, I will or I'm going to. Buddha is the future. Pachimu, why? You need to ask this when your knowledge is patchy and there's a cow. Moo. Okay, not perfect, but it worked. I still remember it. All these years later. Soon enough, we were making up our own memory hooks outside Natasha's lessons. They got more and more weird. To flee, shoes. You need to flee. Also, I thought of a pair of shoes with lots of teeth in it. Zerkala, mirror. See your color. Something you can only do with a mirror. Ribonyak, child. A little girl with ribbons in her hair milking a yak. And dieti, children. Lots of fat kids who clearly need to go on a diet. Dieti, diet. Okay, so they were fun to create, but more importantly, these strong and weird images really, really stuck. If you have a long alien word like tsiakala, you need to learn how many times are you going to need to be exposed to that word before you can remember it. 5, 10, 15? These memory hooks narrowed most, not all, but most of the vocabulary to between just one and a few exposures before they were in my head and ready for recall. Fast forward a couple of years to 2014. I moved to Istanbul and I was asked to do a workshop at the school I was working at. I decided to look into this memory hooking thing to see if there's any research to back it up. And it turns out there was. A lot of research. Much of the groundwork for modern ELT mnemonic techniques hark back to the 1970s, a time not known for its restraint, academic or otherwise. Back then, the world of psychology was breaking off the shackles of behaviorism, and there were all sorts of weird experiments going on in the field of experimental psychology, including those notorious, fascinating, and rather conclusion-jumping split-brain experiments, and the Columbia University researchers who thought they could teach a monkey, who they disingenuously named Nim Chimpsky, how to speak English through sign language. It really didn't work. Amidst the madness, there was some sensible but nonetheless fascinating stuff going on as well, of course. In the early 70s, an experimental psychologist, Gordon Bauer, at Stanford University, became fascinated with Alan Pavio's concept of dual coding. Now, time doesn't allow me to give dual coding its dues here, but in a nutshell, it posits that we have two types of cognition going on in our heads at the same time. One is verbal and language-based, and the other is non-verbal and chiefly consists of images. These two strands are not completely independent. They work simultaneously, and the more we make use of both of them when we're coding information, the better our ability to recall that information later. Bauer was particularly interested in the idea of imaging, to tap into this non-verbal feature of our brains in order to enhance verbal knowledge as opposed to just using verbal techniques. Bauer's experiments on these ideas in the early 70s brought up some fascinating results. In his most famous, his test subjects were presented with 100 different word pairs and had to memorize them. For example, like dog, bicycle, or sun, building. Half of his respondents, the experimental group, were asked to remember the word pairs by imagining the two things interacting with each other in one image. So, with dog and bicycle, you might imagine something like this. A dog riding a bicycle. A nice, strong image. The other half of the respondents were simply left to their own devices to learn the word pairs. The results? The results were quite remarkable. They showed that the subjects using the mnemonic method, imagining the nouns interacting, learnt about 50% more of the vocabulary than the test group. Further experiments testing imaging versus freestyle learning or imaging versus rote repetition yielded similar results, between 53 and 59% stronger recall using the visual memory technique. Okay, but how does this relate to language learning? Well, in 1975, another Stanford professor, Richard Atkinson, decided to see how this technique could be applied to foreign language learning, devising something which he called the keyword method. I always imagine the keyword method as a sort of triangle. Let me explain. On one corner of the triangle, you've got the L2 target word. Let's say you're learning Spanish and you need to learn the word for duck, which is pato or pato. Now, how would a behaviorist learn this word? Well, no imaging at all, right? Because according to behaviorism, imaging isn't a thing. So you'd create an association with the Spanish word pato and the English translation duck. Hey, not very inspiring. So let's add some imaging. So we simply associate the Spanish word pato and an image of the duck. Okay, not bad. But when you apply Bauer's idea of creating a vivid association, you create the third corner of the triangle. And that is where all the magic happens. So how do you do this? Well, you think of an L1 word that resembles the target vocabulary. Pato sounds a bit like pot, right? So imagine a duck running around like an idiot with a pot on its head. The more ridiculous and the more vivid, the better. Atkinson carried out a few experiments on this method. They were fairly similar to Bauer's and yielded similar impressive results. In one experiment, where absolute beginners were given Russian words to memorize, he found that the respondents using the keyword method were able to recall about between 24% and 26% more than the control group, who weren't trained in the keyword method, of course. They were the control group. In other experiments, this time with Spanish vocabulary, the keyword subjects could recall 88% of the vocabulary, with the control group, this time only asked to use rote repetition during the experiment, only recalling 28%. That's a 68% improvement. Juicy, juicy, juicy results, right? Well, there's more, much more. The keyword method was tested again and again and again over the next 3 decades, and the results were, on the whole, pretty solid. Most of the studies were overwhelmingly positive, though there were some that showed some more ambiguous results, especially when it came to long-term retention. I wanted to get an overview of all of this, so I decided to measure all the experiments I could find on the keyword method, 20 in all, ranging from Atkinson's original 1975 experiments to a couple conducted just a couple of years ago, and put them into categories that I gave very, very scientific names to. Category 1, keyword method sucks and totally doesn't work. Category 2, keyword method's okay and kind of works sometimes, but not all the time, and it sort of depends on various factors, but it's okay. And category 3, keyword method is awesome. Okay, and the results. Totally solid. Out of the 20 studies performed on the keyword method over the years, 8 had mixed results, 12 yielded only positive results, and, how's your maths? Drum roll. None of them found solely negative results. It seems visuals are really effective when it comes to learning new vocabulary. Now, time for a quick caveat. This is not to say that using the keyword technique is the only way to learn vocabulary. It's not. Loads of other strategies to language learning have been shown to be just as effective. Storytelling, context creation, discovery methods, semantic organization, and even plain old rote repetition have all been shown to be beneficial. However, what we can see here is, and what many of us as teachers instinctively understand, is that images can make a tricky thing much easier. And after discovering all these fascinating experiments, I started to get a bit obsessed. I would apply the keyword method in my classroom constantly. My rationale was that if this improves vocabulary acquisition as well as the experiments show, then it's worth setting aside a whole session on training my students on how to use it. We came up with keywords together, both in English and in Turkish, because I was teaching in Turkey at the time. Some of the best keywords I have actually come from my students during this period. Things like imagining Orlando Bloom as a flower to remember the word bloom. Things like imagining 2 people dancing the tango and getting in a right mess in order to remember the word to tangle. Things like imagining an archaic witch doctor or handsome prince, in this case, spitting into a patient's mouth in order to cure them, because the Turkish word for spit is tukur. I'm really sorry, but you can't unsee that now. I do apologize for that ghastly image. The students loved them. They lapped it up. Of course, I had no control group, so I could only measure its success through my own teacher's intuition, which was making some very positive sounds. At the very least, It provided motivation for the students to learn new vocabulary and allowed them to see it as something more approachable and less of a chore. My obsession with using images to aid learning continued, and in 2016, my partner and I launched our blog, which we called Clark and Miller, because we totally wanted to confuse people into thinking it was a law firm. Trust me, when we send emails, people read them. I used images a lot in the blog to illustrate tricky concepts, to help students remember vocabulary, and sometimes for reasons that completely escape me now. It was fun and was well received. We've been growing really steadily over the years, and we get lots of lovely ego-stroking feedback. Feedback like this. Yes, anyway, I'm going to dive into a little story right now that starts with a little bout of laziness and ends with this. The book I ended up writing that brings together my obsession with images and learning. One summer, we were on holiday in the UK, just enjoying the sunny weather and being lazy and laid back and, doing holiday stuff. Now, because we were in that holiday mood and we didn't particularly want to spend much time writing, editing, copy editing, getting the right SEO, uploading, formatting, creating the images, and all the things you need to do to publish a post, we had a strategy to minimize our workload so we could go walking in the hills. So we decided to throw stuff up onto the blog that we already had just sort of lying around. Let me explain. During my lessons, I teach one-to-one online these days, I'd accumulated a lot of these. Little images I'd used in the spur of the moment during my lessons to illustrate, literally, one language point or another. Some of these directly utilized the keyword method and some didn't, but they all had something in common. Remember the basis for the keyword method in Bauer's word pair experiment? All my images made use somehow of dual coding, providing an image and some kind of verbal information, whether it's written on the image somewhere, or whether I'm explaining what's going on myself. Some of these worked better than others, and the ones that created that sound, that magic sound, that the aha moment ones, I kept in my drawer. Now, they say that a lot of human innovation comes from our natural inclination to be lazy, and this was no exception. The blog post for the second week of our holiday merely consisted of 11 of these little drawings accompanied by a short explanation. That was it. It took less than an hour to write. Hell, it was already written. We called it 11 Little Drawings That Will Help You Remember English Rules Forever, probably. We published it, did the basic social media promotion, and then went for a walk in the hills. When we got back, we were in for a shock. Our site stats had gone through the roof. The post was getting thousands of views, well over twice our best ever so far. People were sharing it like crazy. It's now had over 4,500 shares, over 4 times as much as our next most shared post, and around 10 to 20 times our average post share count. It kind of went viral. So obviously, this kind of thing speaks to learners, and probably teachers too. So that was it. I was like, okay, let's get more of this out there. I already had lots of these images lying around. I never throw anything away. It's the researcher in me, I guess. So I spent the next year working on bringing these together into one book. A book that makes it easier to grasp those tricky concepts or to remember those tricky words more easily. A book of aha moments. And obviously, I'm very excited about it. It's great for students, but is also chock full of ideas for teachers, simple drawings that you can draw on the board in a couple of seconds, pages that you can just pull out, show at a student who will hopefully react with, right, yeah, okay, it's simple. Or they might even make that wonderful sound, the sound that teachers live for. Okay, but yeah, enough about that book. I got a bit distracted there. While I was writing it, I had a long, hard think about what works and why. What makes a good keyword? What makes a compelling image? What is it that makes students go, ah? What provides those aha moments? I thought about my own experience and how, over the years, I've got better at using images to introduce new vocabulary. One example that always springs to mind is how I used to and how I now teach the word coal. Yeah, coal, that stuff. That stuff you put in your fire if you happen to live during the Industrial Revolution. I found very quickly that just drawing a picture of some coal doesn't help. I mean, really, what's that? That could be anything. When I put it up on the whiteboard, I was just met with lots of confused faces. Okay, so something's missing. How can we provide clarity for this? Context. Context helps provide clarity, right? Okay, so let's go for all the context. Let's show the students how coal is made. Let's illustrate that complicated, muddled procedure of the fossil fuel process. Dinosaurs and plants die, and then we wait, and then the earth squashes them, and then coal, this is coal. That's got all the context, right? More confused faces. So what's the problem here? Right, it's too complicated. It doesn't have impact. You don't get the sound that teachers live for. With this, it's more like, yeah, maybe I know what you mean, maybe. So we need something that has context and impact. Something simple everyone can relate to. Boom. The difference? Impact. The image has to have impact. It has impact because it's a simple drawing. You can see what it is immediately. It also has impact because, context permitting, it triggers something in the students. It has strong emotional connotations. Maybe like the snowman, it reminds us of Christmas and childhood and cancelled school days. Or maybe it's just funny. Or maybe it's absolutely bizarre. So, yeah, what makes a good image? I think it's the combination of clarity, we need to see what it is, and impact. It needs to be simple and effective. Okay, now bearing that in mind, I'd like to turn the tables and bring this over to you. Okay, so take a look at these language points. We've all had to teach them in one way or another before, right? So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to spend about half a minute thinking about it. So pause the video once I've asked this question. Don't pause it now. You don't know what the question is. I see you. Okay, if you could only do it with one image and maybe one or two words, what would you draw on the whiteboard to explain these different language points? Okay, 20 or 30 seconds to think about it. Hit pause now. Okay, hopefully you've hit pause and you've thought about different images. Maybe you've even gone ahead and drawn some of the images. And if you have, good for you. So each of these language points are ones that I've attempted to approach in the book. I thought it would be kind of fun to sort of compare them. So you've got what you've got, and I'll show you what I've got. Remember, it's not a competition. It's just a bit of fun. And also, everyone does things differently, so you can just use what you've got. Or if you prefer mine, use mine. So here we go. Okay, crane. Everyone knows the name for Ukraine. So there it is. Ukraine is a country and a crane in the Ukraine. Imagine a crane in the Ukraine. Make it as easy as possible for the students. What about drown? Well, which direction? You go down. If you're drowning, there's only one direction you go, and that's down. So this word is already in the word. That helps. It's a word they know. Use what they know. A little versus little. Just some silly images can really help clarify differences. Something that's a little bit emotive. We've all had that feeling of I've got very little cash, and we do feel much like this stick figure does. ING and ED. Yeah, I always just imagine the ING as being the source and the ED being like the destination of whatever adjective it is. Poor. Well, the word poor sounds like the word pour, which the students will have. They know the word pour, so now they can use the word pour. So if you go to a dinner party, who's pouring the drinks? It's the poor people who pour the drinks. The poor. The passive, again, a strong visual thing. I just thought, just add be. Add be. That's all you need to do, really. I mean, there's verb 3. That can come later, but if the students have got this whole be thing, they're in. Keep it as simple as possible. Students are smart. They're humans. They're logical. They can make creative jumps. So if you just give them something small to start with, they can build from there. Articles. Yeah, the whole communication and language is all about what we believe the person listening to us knows. It's all about shared knowledge, and we always modify our language based on that. So articles are that is the core of how articles work. What does the other person know? Does the other person know about the cat or not? And that's it. That's really basically the logic behind articles. And finally, little versus few. Sometimes I think it's a really good way. Sometimes I think a really good way to help students out with their mistakes is showing them what kind of mistakes they're making and what it actually means when it means something funny. Like one of my students came out with, there were lots of men and very little women, which put this image into my head. So sometimes if you've got a good rapport with your students, create an image of what they actually said. Your mistakes in pictures can be very useful. Okay, so before we finish, there are just a few things I want to conclude with. Research is important, but I think we should also never underestimate the power of a teacher's instinct. How many second language acquisition studies have been conducted, meticulous, careful and scientific studies and meta-studies with strong conclusions and fascinating insights, only for most teachers to look at them and just say, yeah, we already knew that. We've been doing this for years. A lot of the time, it feels like the academic world confirms things that teachers already knew and what teachers were already doing. Not always. There are some serious misconceptions out there, but a lot of the time, teachers' instinct tends to be more or less on the nose. And that's fine. I'm an academic myself. It's important for this to work, but teachers are usually one step ahead of the mark. So some of these images may not work for your classroom. No one knows your students more than you do. Some of your students may have different approaches to self-study, and often this needs to be respected too. But having said that, I think we can say most of our students respond well to images most of the time. Remember the principle of dual cognition. Engage the senses and the verbal at the same time. And if you decide to do that with images, when you're reaching for the board in order to clarify X, Y, or Z, try to keep in mind that magic combination. Clarity plus impact equals aha moment. And that's it. Thanks very much for coming to the Ask the Expert. It was great to talk to you. And thanks for watching this. You made it to the end. Congratulations. Here's all my details. I've probably already shown this to you during Featured Teacher and during Ask the Expert, but here it is again. You can send me an email, ask me questions, send me a cat video, that sort of thing. Follow the blog. We've got a podcast. It's all there. Just go to the website. You know what to do. You know how the internet works, I presume. Thanks a lot, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.